This lesson will give you some tips on how to write a how-called summary response paper, which is a great exercise to prepare you for higher studies. When you write a summary response paper, you summarize an article that you've read and you give your own thoughts on it. This gives you a chance to practice your analytical skills as well as referencing sources within your text. If you need tips on what to think about when summarizing a text, you can check out my video lesson called Writing a Summary. And if you want to know more about source referencing, have a look at the lesson called Citing Sources. Links in the description. Let's have a look at an example of a summary response paper. This example is taken from the course book Blueprint A, and you can find it on page 124 if you have the book. It's a response to the article Girl Asserts Right to Her Own Life, which you can find in the same book on page 103. I'd like to emphasize that this example is pretty high level to be considered English 5. While you're in English 5, you don't have to be able to do the things I'm about to show you as skillfully as they're done in this example. But there's no reason why you shouldn't at least get to see it so you know what's expected of you if you continue your academic studies. Let's have a look at this summary response paper. It's titled The Power of One Girl. Here we go. Now, what you should pay attention to is the structure and how the writer uses phrasing to show what information comes from the article and what is their own reflections. So let's read it. In the article Girl Asserts Right to Her Own Life, published in Africa Today, October 24th, 2017, June Soyinka shows how Memory Banda, a girl from the African state of Malawi, grew up in bad conditions and faced traditional initiation rites but refused to take part. This changed her whole village and allowed girls to go to school and take charge of their own lives. The Inca describes how, after losing her father, Memory Banda, her mother, and a younger sister often starved because they didn't have enough food. Banda then explains to Inca that when girls in her village get to their first period, they have to go to an initiation camp where they are supposed to become women. They are forced to have sex with men, strangers, who are paid to do that. Often the girls become pregnant and get sexually transmitted diseases such as camps. The Inca continues by describing why Banda refused to go to the initiation rite. She didn't want to become pregnant, get married, or stay uneducated. She wanted a different life. She wanted to go to school, and as the writer observes, Banda is now studying at the university. In the article, the Inca also reports that Banda managed to make the legislature in Malawi change the law so that no one can marry before the age of 18, as well as have mothers support girls' rights to education. In the end, the Inca states that if you change the mind of one person, you will change a village and soon a country. I believe that it is very important that girls have the chance to go to school and get an education. It will give them more choices in their own lives and they will be able to work and provide for their children. Research also shows that when women are educated and work, it contributes to a better economic development for the whole country, lifting the population out of poverty. So the very first thing that this writer does is give us all the information about the article they are writing about, which is important if you're going to do this properly. We get the title of the original article, where and when it was published, and who wrote it, Chunsi Inca. And the next paragraph begins, Soyinka, the writer of the article, describes how, so on. And this is also important if you're doing it properly. When you're writing anything where you're using outside sources, especially if you're using several different sources, or if you're mixing in your own views and thoughts, it's important to make clear what information comes from those sources. Here's a general rule. You mention a reference, like they do here in the first paragraph, and then you report on something that that reference says. And when you want to say something new, you start a new paragraph. So when you jump to a new paragraph, the reader will assume that now you're done with this reference. Now you're starting something new. And if you're not done with that reference, if you're just moving on to a new topic within that reference, you need to repeat the reference. You can see this is exactly what this writer does here. Next paragraph begins, Soyinka continues by describing so on, and then in the article, Soyinka also reports, reference again, and next one, in the end, Soyinka states, reference, and then finally, I believe, so now we're on to personal reflections. So you can see it's very clear that everything up until the last paragraph comes from this source. It's a report on what the article is about, all the information that comes from that article and no other source. And also notice you can pause and read the text again if you feel that you need to, but notice how well structured this is. Even if you haven't read the original article, you can still see that this summary follows a very clear red thread, with this last bit kind of summing up the conclusion of the original article. And then the final paragraph is personal reflections, which you can see from how it begins, I believe. It's also worth mentioning how this particular text is a very good example of a kind of double referencing. The article that the writer is responding to is obviously about this girl or woman, Memory Banda. It's her that it's about, but she's not the reference. She did not write the article. It was June Soyinka who did. So you see, we can't say Banda says, Banda reports, and so on. It has to be like it is here. Soyinka continues to describe why Banda and so on. Banda explains to Soyinka, and Soyinka reports that Banda and so on. Now this is because technically the reporter, Soyinka, who wrote the article, may have got something wrong in her article, and in any case, she's the one who wrote it. So even if the story is about Banda, the one who wrote the article is the one who needs to be named as reference. I also want you to notice how very skillfully this writer uses language to avoid sounding repetitive. Like I said, when done properly, every paragraph except the last one does need to begin with the reference, so we understand that it's still about the article that this person read. But it would be annoying to read if all of them began, the article says, the article says, the article says, or Soyinka writes, Soyinka writes, Soyinka writes. It would be too repetitive. That becomes annoying. So notice how this writer uses varied language. Soyinka describes how, so on and so on. Soyinka continues by describing. In the article, Soyinka also reports. In the end, Soyinka states. It's different ways of phrasing it. It becomes more interesting to read and less repetitive. So that's very well done. What words you're using is also important. This article that the text is referring to, it's obviously of a descriptive nature. It describes some life events, the events of Memory Banda. So we can say that the writer describes, reports, states, says, writes, explains, and so on. And if you choose to write a summary response paper of an argumentative text, then you may want to use words such as the writer argues, they claim, they suggest, and so on. So make sure to understand what the original writer, the article that you are writing about, what they do, what kind of article it is. Do they say and report and state something? Do they explain? Or are they arguing and claiming and suggesting? Is it argumentative or is it descriptive? Now, as far as summary response papers go, I would personally want to see more of the response bit than is shown here. This example has a very good summary of the original article, a very clear structure, clear references, and exceptional use of language, but the response part is quite short in my mind. I read this last paragraph and I feel like I want to know more. For example, I'd like to know this bit. Research shows that when women are educated. I'd like to know what this research is. I feel like I want to know more about this. I want it to be longer. But that's just my opinion. That's my personal opinion. But if you're one of my students and you decide to write a summary response paper, I would very much like to see the response bit taking up a bigger part of the paper than is shown in this example. But I hope you found this lesson helpful and that you will now feel a little more confident in writing your own summary response paper. And I look forward to reading it.